Rome used crucifixion deliberately, not just to end a life, but to send a message that outlasted the life itself. Bodies were raised beside roads and left there, sometimes for days, visible to every traveller who passed. The method was chosen for its duration as much as its brutality. It wasn't designed to kill quickly. The condemned was fixed to the wood in a position that made breathing possible only through effort. To inhale, you had to push upwards on whatever was holding you. Each breath had to be earned. Exhaustion set in sometimes over hours, possibly over days. And when officials wanted it finished by nightfall, soldiers would break the legs of the crucified so they could no longer push up, and suffocation followed quickly. Every part of it was considered, every part of it was intentional. The Romans called it the extreme penalty. They also called it the humiliation. It was considered too degrading for Roman citizens. It was reserved for slaves, for foreigners, for rebels, for people whose deaths Rome wanted seen, discussed, and remembered by as many people as possible. They had also used it at scale before. In 71 BC, after the slave revolt led by Spartacus had been crushed, the Roman general Crassus crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way, the main road running south out of Rome. 6,000 crosses set at intervals stretching for over 100 miles. Every traveller entering or leaving the city passed through that corridor. The message required no translation. In Judea specifically, crucifixion had become a regular feature of Roman rule in the generation before Jesus was born. When Herod the Great died in 4 BC, the region erupted into open revolt. The Roman legate of Syria, a man called Varus, marched in to restore order. And when his campaign was over, he crucified 2,000 people around Jerusalem in one operation. Josephus records it with the flat brevity of someone describing something that was, unfortunately, not all that unusual. 2,000 in one place as a demonstration. The town of Sepphoris, 4 miles from Nazareth, was burned to the ground during that same campaign. Its population was enslaved. If Jesus was born around the time historians generally place his birth, he would have grown up a short walk from a town that carried the living memory of what Roman order looked like when it felt threatened. The rebuilt city, Romanized, prosperous, would have stood as a daily reminder of who had done the rebuilding and why. This is the world he was born into, not a distant, abstract Roman world. A world of crosses on roads and burned towns, and a population that understood from recent experience exactly what the cost of resistance looked like. A crucified man was a closed argument, a story ended publicly, deliberately, with enough force that no one could mistake what the ending meant. From Rome's point of view, the story of Jesus of Nazareth should have closed there, but it didn't. Most people encounter Jesus through religion long before they encounter him through history. That's understandable. His name appears in art, in music, in the rituals that mark the year in much of the world. He can come to feel like a figure from a different category altogether, maybe more symbol than person, more theology than history. Historians come at it differently. They start with the sources. When scholars look at what survives from the first century, something becomes clear fairly quickly. References to Jesus appear in texts written within living memory of his lifetime, and crucially, not only from people who believed in him. We have accounts from outside observers, people with no investment in the Christian movement, people who, in some cases, found the whole thing contemptible. Those are the witnesses that carry the most weight in historical argument. Nobody invents hostile evidence for their own cause. One of the most important comes from a man called Flavius Josephus. He was a Jewish historian writing in Rome in the early 90s AD. He had deep first-hand knowledge of Judea, its politics, its religious landscape, and its recent violent history. He had actually served as a military commander during the Jewish revolt against Rome in the 60s AD, switched sides when it became clear that the cause was lost, and spent the rest of his life in Rome writing detailed histories of the Jewish people for a Roman audience. He wasn't a Christian. He had made his peace with Roman power in a way that many of his own people found difficult to forgive. In his Antiquities of the Jews, a history running to 20 volumes, Josephus describes the execution of a man named James by the Jerusalem authorities. Almost as an aside, he identifies this James as the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James. That's it. No theology, no attempt to explain who Jesus was or why he mattered. Josephus simply uses him as a reference point, the way you would use a name only when you're confident your reader already knows it. He wasn't writing for Christians, he was writing for educated Romans. And he assumed, without explaining it, that they already knew who Jesus of Nazareth was. Most scholars regard this passage as authentic Josephus. That careful, slightly distancing phrase, the one called Christ, not the Christ, reads like a non-believer's precision, not the kind of thing a later Christian scribe would have inserted. And then there's Tacitus. He's considered by many to be the greatest historian Rome ever produced. A senator's son, a former consul, a man with a sharp eye for political hypocrisy, and very little patience for what he saw as Eastern superstitions flooding into the capital. Writing around 116 AD, he describes how Emperor Nero, desperate to deflect suspicion after a catastrophic fire destroyed much of Rome, settled on a community already unpopular with the Roman public, and then he explains where they came from. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for a moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Notice the tone. Mischievous superstition, first source of the evil. Tacitus was not a sympathizer. He finds the whole thing distasteful, and he doesn't even bother hiding it. Now, some scholars have pointed out that Tacitus was probably reporting what Christians themselves told him, rather than consulting official Roman records. That's worth acknowledging, but it's less damaging than it might first appear. What Tacitus gives us, at minimum, is evidence that by 116 AD, the crucifixion under Pilate was the settled, established account of how Christianity began, accepted as fact even by people who despised the religion. If that account had been invented, there were still people alive who could have challenged it. Nobody did. It was noted with contempt and moved past. The mainstream scholarly view, a genuine consensus with a small but vocal minority dissenting, is that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person. That doesn't settle the theological questions. It doesn't tell us what he was, but it does mean he can't remain an abstraction. His life has to be placed back into a specific world among specific forces at a specific moment in history. And once you do that, a more interesting question surfaces. Why did this particular man, a man who ended his life the way Rome ended the lives of criminals and rebels, become one of the most significant figures in all of human history? What was it about him and about the world he moved through that made what came next possible at all? The Roman Empire in the first century was enormous. It governed peoples across 3 continents, each with their own traditions, languages, and gods. And for the most part, Rome didn't try to iron that out. The Romans at this point were pragmatic imperialists. What they cared about was the practical business of running an empire. Taxes collected, trade routes working, local populations not generating unrest that required expensive military intervention. As long as those conditions held, Rome was content to leave the detail of local life to local people who understood it better than any administrator from Rome ever would. Judea was the exception. It broke that pattern repeatedly, consistently, across generations, in ways that exhausted a long succession of governors and baffled the officials who read their reports back in Rome. The reason wasn't simply that the Jewish population was difficult to manage, though Roman governors frequently described them in exactly those terms. It was that in this society, religious identity and political identity had fused so completely that you couldn't address one without disturbing the other. The belief in the God of Israel wasn't one set of customs among many. It shaped everything: the understanding of law, of history, of the land itself. And embedded in that belief was something that made foreign occupation feel more than a political inconvenience. It felt like a contradiction of how the world was supposed to be. And not all Roman governors helped. Pontius Pilate served as prefect of Judea from 26 to 36 AD, and he left enough of a record that we can form a fairly clear picture of him. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher writing in the first century, described him plainly as inflexible, stubborn, and cruel. Josephus gives us a series of specific incidents that back that up. Shortly after taking office, Pilate had his troops bring military standards bearing the image of the emperor into Jerusalem under the cover of night. Every governor before him had avoided this, knowing it would be seen as a deliberate provocation. Pilate either didn't know or didn't care. A crowd of Jews marched immediately to his residence and remained there for 5 days in silent protest. When Pilate finally met with them, he had soldiers surround the crowd with drawn swords. He threatened to cut them all down. And the Jews? Well, they knelt and bared their throats, indicating that they would rather die than back down. Faced with a massacre that would cause him serious problems with Rome, Pilate relented and the standards were removed. On another occasion, he took money from the temple treasury to fund an aqueduct. The temple treasury was considered sacred, untouchable. When protesters gathered to object, Pilate sent soldiers in plain clothes to mix with the crowd and then, at a signal, produced clubs and beat them. People died. Later in his tenure, he massacred a group of Samaritans who had gathered at a holy site, interpreting their presence as a potential insurrection. The Samaritans complained to the governor of Syria, who ordered Pilate back to Rome to account for himself. He was removed from office around 36 or 37 AD. What happened to him after that is unknown. This is the man who authorized the crucifixion of Jesus, not the conflicted, hand wringing figure of Christian imagination, but a prefect with a documented pattern of provocation, disproportionate violence, and a consistent inability to read the people he governed. The crucifixion of Jesus was, for Pilate, a routine decision. One more name on a list, another file closed. But to understand why that file didn't stay closed, you have to understand what was running beneath the surface of Judean society in the first century. For centuries, the Jewish people had understood their history through a particular framework, a story of liberation from slavery, of a covenant struck with God, of a kingdom given, partially lost, and partially recovered, of exile in Babylon, of return, of a brief period of genuine independence, and then of foreign domination once more. First the Greeks, then Rome, which had been the real power in the region since Pompey marched into Jerusalem in 63 BC. What made this history unusual wasn't the events themselves. Plenty of peoples in the ancient world had experienced conquest and occupation. What made it unusual was the lens through which it was read. These weren't just political events. They were understood as chapters in an ongoing relationship between God and his people, a relationship that hadn't ended, that was still moving towards something. Their scriptures spoke of a future moment, a decisive intervention, a point at which God would act in history in a way that couldn't be missed, restoring justice, renewing the covenant, transforming the situation of his people in a way that couldn't be undone. Different groups within Judaism imagined that moment differently. Some expected a military figure to drive out Rome, others a priestly figure to purify the temple. Some believed that faithful observance of the law would hasten it, others that armed resistance would force it. The details differed widely, but the expectation itself was shared, and it had a name: Messiah, the Anointed One, a figure through whom God would somehow act to bring about the transformation his people had been promised. The difficulty, from Rome's perspective, was that this kind of expectation kept producing men who believed they were called to bring it about. Josephus catalogues them as something approaching wariness. There was Judas of Galilee, who led a revolt against the Roman census in 6 AD, teaching that paying Roman taxes was incompatible with loyalty to God. His movement was crushed, and he was killed. But his sons were crucified decades later by a subsequent governor, which suggests the movement had never quite died. Then there was a man called Theodos, who, in the 40s AD, gathered a large following and led them down to the River Jordan, promising that the waters would part as they had for Moses, that God's deliverance was beginning again right now. The Roman procurator sent cavalry. Theodos was beheaded, and his head was displayed publicly. His followers ran. And then there was a man called the Egyptian. Josephus says that he drew thousands of people to the Mount of Olives in the 50s AD, promising the walls of Jerusalem would fall at his word. The Roman governor sent in troops. The crowd was cut down. The Egyptian himself escaped and was never found. Each time the pattern was the same. A figure emerges, gathers followers through the language of prophetic fulfillment, makes a dramatic claim about God's imminent action in history, and is destroyed by Roman military force before things can escalate further. Each time, Rome believes the problem is resolved, and each time, the underlying expectation simply waits for the next person who seems to fit. Into this world charged with expectation, littered with the wreckage of failed movements, watched at all times by a military power that had learned to treat prophetic enthusiasm as a security threat, a man from Galilee begins to speak about the kingdom of God. And people listen in ways they hadn't listened before. The gospel narratives are the main sources we have for what happened next. Historians read them carefully. They were produced by communities of believers, shaped over decades of retelling, and they weren't designed as biography in any modern sense. They require critical reading. But what emerges even through that critical reading is a consistent portrait, a man moving through the towns and villages of Galilee, teaching publicly, attracting attention that keeps growing beyond his ability to contain it. His central theme was the kingdom of God. In first century Judea, that phrase carried a weight that's easy to miss today. It wasn't about the afterlife, it wasn't an abstraction. To speak about God's kingdom was to speak about God's authority becoming visible within history, displacing the authorities currently in charge. In a land occupied by Rome, the implications of that language were impossible to avoid, whatever the speaker intended. What made Jesus unusual wasn't that he used this language, others had. What made him unusual is how he positioned it in time. He didn't speak about God's kingdom as something coming, something to be hoped for while present circumstances continued. He spoke about it as something already arriving, already breaking through into the present, visible, he said, to anyone paying close enough attention. In seeds grown quietly in fields, in meals shared with people nobody expected to be invited, in encounters with the people society had pushed to its edges. Think about what it would mean to hear that. You are living in a village in Galilee. Your grandparents watched Roman soldiers march through. You grew up hearing those ancient promises read aloud every week in the synagogue. You know about Judas, about Theudas, about the Egyptian, and you know exactly how those stories ended. And now, this teacher is standing in front of you saying, not one day, not eventually, but now. The thing you've been waiting for is already beginning. Right here, among ordinary people, in ordinary places. What do you do with that? Well, some people followed him. Not just listened and went home, but left what they were doing and went with him. Others were drawn to the healings, which the sources describe consistently enough across enough independent traditions that historians take them seriously as a real feature of his ministry, whatever one makes of them. Others were unsettled, suspicious, openly hostile. And the hostility wasn't random, it had a source. Religious authority in first century Judea wasn't separate from political authority. The two were tied together so tightly that a challenge to one was always, at least potentially, a challenge to the other. The priestly leadership in Jerusalem operated in a careful arrangement with Roman power. They maintained control over Jewish religious communal life, including the temple and its considerable treasury, in exchange for keeping the population stable enough that Rome didn't have to intervene directly. It was a difficult arrangement, and everyone involved understood it for what it was. The high priesthood, by this period, was effectively a Roman appointment. Men that held office at Rome's pleasure. and kept it by demonstrating they could manage the population. Into this arrangement steps a teacher from Galilee whose following keeps growing, whose claims keep pushing against the boundaries of accepted religious authority, and whose presence in Jerusalem during the most volatile week of the year is impossible for anyone in power to ignore. Minor doctrinal disputes don't get people killed. The fact that the tension surrounding Jesus kept escalating, kept pulling people in with the authority and the motivation to act on it, tells you precisely how his claims were being heard. Not as interesting commentary on existing tradition, as something that required a response. Jerusalem during Passover was unlike anywhere else in the Roman Empire. Pilgrims arrived in their tens of thousands from Judea, from Galilee, from the wider Jewish area spread across the Mediterranean world. The population of the city multiplied in a matter of days. The atmosphere was charged, not just with the religious significance of the festival, but with everything that significance implied in a city living under foreign occupation. A celebration of liberation from slavery, held in a city that didn't feel free. The tension was always there during Passover. Everyone knew it. Pontius Pilate made sure that he was there, not for the ceremony, but as a precaution. The Roman authorities had learned from experience that Jerusalem during Passover was where the pressures building throughout the year in the Jewish population were most likely to find a sudden violent release. Having the prefect present, with additional troops stationed in the Antonia fortress overlooking the temple courts, was Rome's way of managing a city it never fully understood. It is into this atmosphere that Jesus arrives from Galilee. The confrontations that had been developing across months of ministry in the villages of Galilee surface here in concentrated form. The debates become direct. The questions about authority aren't theoretical anymore. They are put to him publicly by people with the standing to demand answers in front of crowds that are paying close attention. The different factions that had formed around him, those convinced he's something significant, those alarmed by what he might set in motion, those whose own authority is directly threatened by his claims, all arrive at clearer positions than they had held before. The arrest happens that night, outside the city walls, away from the crowds. The process that follows moves through both Jewish deliberation and Roman jurisdiction. Historians continue to debate its precise legal form. What isn't in dispute is the outcome. Pontius Pilate authorizes the execution. Jesus is crucified outside the city, in public, in the manner Rome had used for Spartacus's followers on the Appian Way, for 2,000 rebels outside Jerusalem a generation earlier, and for every figure who had gathered people around a claim Rome considered dangerous. His public ministry ends. From a Roman administrative perspective, this was routine. A potentially destabilizing figure removed during a volatile festival week. Exactly the kind of decision Pilate had made before and would make again, right up until the moment he was recalled to Rome for making too many of them too carelessly. For Pilate, the crucifixion of Jesus was a forgettable morning's work. The crowds disperse, the tension releases, the city returns to its complicated normal. The story, by every precedent Rome had developed for managing exactly this kind of situation, was over. And here is where things become genuinely strange. Within weeks of the crucifixion, not months, not years, Something is happening among the people who followed Jesus. Not the quiet, demoralized scattering that had followed every previous movement of this kind. Something different. Communities began forming quickly, not just in Jerusalem, but spreading through Judea and into the wider Mediterranean world. They had come to the attention of Jewish authorities in Jerusalem within months. They're in Damascus, then Antioch, then cities across the Eastern Empire. Within 20 years of the crucifixion, while people who had known Jesus personally were still alive, Paul is writing letters to establish networks of these communities stretching from Jerusalem to Greece. Think about that timeline. Paul's letters are the earliest surviving Christian documents. What's striking about them isn't just their content, it's what they assume. He writes as though his readers are already part of a functioning, organized movement with shared beliefs and shared traditions. He isn't inventing something from scratch. He's writing to communities that already exist and have existed long enough to have their own internal disagreements. By the time Tacitus is writing in 116 AD, he can describe, with the bored contempt of a man noting a persistent irritation, a movement that originated in Judea, was briefly checked by the execution of its founder, and then spread all the way to Rome, large enough that Nero, 50 years earlier, had been able to use it as a scapegoat for burning half the city. Tacitus says this as background, as settled history, something requiring no explanation. Compare that to what came before. Judas of Galilee's sons were crucified decades after their father's revolt, but the movement never left Judea. Theodos's followers scattered the moment the cavalry arrived, and the Egyptians' crowd ran, and the man himself disappeared. None of those movements, when their leader was killed, looked up from the disaster and produced something that got larger. This one did. The historical puzzle isn't really whether Jesus existed. The evidence, including the testimony of people who had every reason to dismiss him, points in one clear direction. The puzzle is the gap between a man crucified by a provincial official who probably never thought about him again, and the movement that followed his death and refused, against every available precedent, to behave the way such things were supposed to behave. What the earliest followers of Jesus said had happened, what they staked everything on having happened in the days after his crucifixion, is the question at the center of all of this. And that's where things get complicated. Thank you. Until next time, take care.